All right, welcome in episode 18 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. I'm your host, Stevie MacDonald. And what I want to get into with this episode is the article on ESPN about how each top 2020 college football team can become a contender this season. And specifically with that, I want to go over what they had to say about Michigan heading into 2020. And the way that this article breaks down by ESPN is they kind of did it as a if-then hypothetical situation, meaning if this happens, then Michigan or the other teams that they had on their list will be contenders in 2020. And for Michigan specifically, they had four if-then hypothetical situations here, and really I'm not sure if they intended it to be as in if all four of these things happen, then they'll be contender, or if one of each individual things that they listed happens, then they will be. But in the way that I took it as, okay, if all four of these things happen, then I could definitely see them being in that conversation, both contending for a Big Ten title and even possibly going into a college football playoff scenario. So as I said, there's four of them that they listed. The first being if 2021 arrives early. So Michigan has a very young team this year after they lost so many players this past season to the NFL draft, where ESPN says they only predict about 5 or 6 senior starters on either side of the ball total for Michigan this upcoming season, and there are even less senior backups to that. And Michigan lost 4 of their 5 starters on the offensive line going to the NFL, and the sophomore class or second-year players such as Cam McGrone, Dax Hill, Zach Charbonnet, Giles Jackson, just to name a few, are really seen as being primed and ready to take a big step forward here coming up in 2020 and even beyond. Like I said, they said if 2021 arrives early, so they imagine big things for these guys later on in their careers as well. But really, I think it also kind of is more so amplified on the offensive side of the ball. As I mentioned, you've got guys like Zach Charbonnet and Giles Jackson will be in their second years with this offensive group in the second year of that Josh Gaddis offense. So hopefully a big second year jump coming for that offense. Now the second thing is if the new offensive line gels well. And now this is going to be a big one because this is, I think, where a lot of that jump for this offense as a whole will come from, is how this offensive line retools, losing those 4 guys to the NFL this past year with only their right tackle, Jalen Mayfield, coming back. And I think that being able to, as I mentioned, retool that offensive line should really do a couple things, and that is to transition into a new quarterback for this offense, whether it's Dylan McCaffrey, Joe Milton, Cade McNamara, whoever it ends up being able to ease that transition a little more while also creating some continuity in building off that already solid running game that they established last year with that two-headed monster of Charbonnet and Hassan Haskins, but now also being able to add a third dimension to that running game with incoming freshman Blake Corum. And then we kind of switch to the defensive side of the ball with this third one. It's if Don Brown can return. So Don Brown has basically been one of the best defensive coordinators in the college ranks during his time in Ann Arbor, where he's been a finalist for the National Assistant Coach of the Year award multiple times. And really his defenses, when you look at them, are kind of what you would call home run hitters, where they're fast, aggressive, and explosive. But his only real problem has been against teams like Ohio State, whose offenses are also very explosive and very fast. And specifically with Ohio State, his defenses have given up nearly 60 points per game each of the last 2 meetings with the Buckeyes. So if he can solve that problem with defending the Buckeyes offense, Michigan's defense is good enough where they could possibly play themselves into that contender conversation this year. And then the final point is if the red zone is friendlier to the Wolverines. So Michigan struggled in the red zone in 2019, averaging 4.9 points per opportunity in the red zone, which ranked 34th in the FBS, while giving up 5 points per opportunity, which was good for 115th in the FBS, for a net total of -0.1 differential. Whereas when you go back to 2019 and look at the 4 teams that made the college football playoff, their average net differential was plus 1.1. So they were scoring on average over 1 point more per possession opportunity that they had in the red zone. So if Michigan, like I said, if Michigan wants to take that next step forward and really build off that momentum they had going offensively in the second half of 2019, they got to do it by getting it done in the red zone. That's a place where they really struggled last year, where they would get down in the red zone, they'd move the ball downfield relatively easily, then they'd get inside the red zone and kind of just stall out and not really get anywhere. So if they can take that next step in the offense, if they can keep that continuity going with the running game, kind of ease that transition for the new quarterback, whoever it ends up being, which all comes from that offensive line group, then Michigan, along with solving their problem with Ohio State, should be able to play themselves into that conversation for contending for both the Big Ten and college football playoff. And I mentioned it on a previous episode of the podcast recently that if Michigan can get past that game against Washington in week 1, their schedule isn't all that tough, seeing as how they have Wisconsin and Penn State at home. Yes, it's in back-to-back weeks, but again, they're both at home this year, so that helps out a little. Yes, they get Michigan State on the road, but as I mentioned in that episode, I only see Michigan State going about 5-7 this year at best, really. So if Michigan can get past that game against Washington, they should have a relatively easy time until they get to that Ohio State game, and that will be their real test for 2020 in the progression of this offense and, you know, some of these second year and third year guys coming up on this defense as well. So that's going to do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this post. Also, check out takingthefield.com for any past episodes of the podcast, and we'll get back to this pretty soon. But that'll do it for this one. Thanks for listening.